everyone, before we start the actual walkthrough of how to animate the jump to action animation, I do want to give you some options for how you can follow along and how you can animate your final scene. First, you could follow along step by step and use the reference that I've provided, so you could animate kind of exactly as I'm doing. Or you could follow along step by step, push the animation a bit more and incorporate your reference. So if you like your jump better and you want to use that as reference, you can. Or if you like the walk that you do across the bridge better, you can use that. So you would be using my reference and using your reference, just kind of incorporating those together. Finally, you could review the step-by-step walkthrough, but use your own reference to animate the entire scene. So learn from the step-by-step, but ultimately use your reference to animate the scene completely. So those are your options. Now let's go ahead and look at the poses that a jump actually has within it and kind of discuss those a bit. Usually when I'm teaching you anything, I like to go over the why and what of the lesson. So for this instance, we're going to deconstruct the jump before we look at it in our scene in Maya, so you really understand what's happening before we start just manipulating our character to look like our reference. So these are the key poses involved in a jump. You would have your neutral pose before the jump begins. And our neutral pose allows the character to take note of their destination. It kind of sets them up to begin that jump. Anticipation is the next pose, and this is the squashed pose that allows the character to anticipate the next action. It prepares your audience as well for what's about to happen, and the character's building up momentum for the jump. We have the jump or contact pose. This is the stretch up that helps shape the jump movement and is the beginning of the arc of the jump. All of the energy is being pushed up into the air. The arms are swinging forward to give more momentum. The character is springing up from the anticipation pose. And at least one foot in this pose will be touching the ground. So it's contacting the ground. Next, we have our mid-air pose. This is the highest point of the arc or the jump. And at this point, the character is a bit in free fall. The character is also anticipating that landing. Next is the fall pose, which is where the character is first touching the ground with their heel of their foot. Also take note as it's stretching up. It's helping really shape that arc within that jump. Finally, we have a recovery pose, which has some squash and allows the character to absorb the weight. The momentum is pushing the character forward and down to the ground. The arms swing forward to help balance the weight. And then finally, we're back to our neutral pose, which is kind of a transition pose. Next, I just have a breakdown of these poses as a human is doing them. This is Muybridge, a Muybridge image. He has tons of these different images where he really slowed down or took high-speed images so we can really see the movements throughout whatever action they're completing. So if you notice, the arms are creating kind of this arc motion throughout the jump. You can, if you focus on the head of the person, that's also creating this arc throughout the jump. You have this stretch up, and he also has that stretch down. For our animation, we would need to put that pose in that allows the feet to contact first. You wouldn't just land flat-footed, but this is still a nice breakdown of this action. He has that squash that we were talking about, the stretch up. This is that free fall top position of the arc. And this is where he's starting to recover from that jump. All right, if we look at this animated character doing this jump, we can really see all those poses that we just discussed. And in-betweens between those main poses will help show the arc motions of these arms, really make them feel like they're doing a swing up and things like that. So we'll have those main poses, but then we'll also have these in-betweens to help really sell that motion. All right, now that I'm back in the file here, I went ahead and double checked that my settings are correct and that I'm still on linear and stepped. And I also set my project. I'm going to go ahead and, actually I'm not going to turn off that Temple Master yet. Just know that we do have that reference video in there. We need to get this character to the ground. I thought I had placed her on the ground, but she's a little in the air here. And we also, I want to turn the move control to kind of face this direction so we can start our neutral pose and jump toward this pillar here. So I think this was like 1.23, gets around the ground. Enter. Notice I just have this move all control. That's all I'm translating, and I'm not going to set any keys on this. So her feet are a little above or below, so maybe that might work. Just kind of whatever values I plug in, that's what you need. So you don't have to test with me if you don't want to. I'll let you know that value in just a second. That can work. It's not too bad. All right, so make sure your translate Y on that move all is 1.45. And then I'm also going to rotate this character toward this next beam. It kind of looks like there's something jetting through this. We'll leave it there. I'll clean it up for the next class. Sorry about that, guys. There's like a little spike going through the platform, and I didn't notice it until just now. Now that we have that done, I'm just going to rotate this along the green axis, which should be Y. Yep. And I'm just going to kind of make sure that this move all is pointing toward that pillar. That looks good. When you're jumping, when your character's jumping, they can't change direction in the air, so you need to get that direction set up before you get started. All right, so now we're ready to start animating, and in order to be able to see everything, I am going to turn off my temple scene. Make sure if you decide to do any additional changes to the beginning, I think I'm going to just kind of jump from this positioning. Make sure you're forming the foot to kind of lay on this curve here. Since there's a curve, her foot can't just be flat, so you'll have to work that out a little bit. So if you keep it where she's got the neutral pose on this flat area and she jumps from this flat area, it'll be a lot easier to work with. All right, so this is going to be our neutral pose. I want to start this animation at 1. I don't want to start at 0. And if you notice, as we go through, let me extend this. We're at 24 frames per second, but my video that I recorded for reference was at 60 frames per second. So it's going to take a lot of time to get to those poses. And you might have to we might have to move the timing around after we get all of our poses set. I'd rather just go through, set all the poses, and then move the timing, because then you don't have to worry about trying to change the offset of this video every time you want to set a pose, because you can frame offset, so maybe your video isn't starting exactly where you want it. If I go over to 1 and I want to start where I'm bending, I'll go to 75. And then that frame is where we're starting on frame 1 now, if that makes sense. So it just moves further into that video, so we're not starting at that standing neutral pose. So you would have to do that for every single pose if you want to start with doing the timing first, because this is at 60 frames per second. So it's just easier just to set your poses, and then we'll go through and clean everything up. If you can't fully see what's in the body, you have to kind of go back to those first images and information that I shared about a jump. You can look at what's happening throughout the body. It'll guide you to see what's happening throughout your reference. I can't see completely here because of the arm, but if you look at our reference or the previous images, there's a bend in the back here. And another way to figure out the pose is, you know, that whatever's happening in that spine is counter animating within the hip and cog. It's more important to get this cog animated than this hip, because if you notice, the spine doesn't move. The cog actually affects the spine. We want the spine affected so then we can counter animate that information. Okay? So this hip actually just kind of pushes and cleans up what's happening once you do that bend with the cog. Can push it a little bit more. All right, now that we know all that, let's go ahead and start our first pose. I think I'm going to spread these feet out just a little bit. This isn't an exact science. This is kind of eyeballing everything. So I might say something and then decide the next second that I want to change it. Be prepared for that. So what I'm going to do first is move the cog. I like working with the IK controls because I feel like it's easier to get my arm in place and I can do more of what I want with that arm. It's just, you don't have to rotate every single little movement within that arm. You can just translate it now with the wrist control. And then you can move the elbow in place to give or the elbow pivot control to give the shape that you want to the arm. It's important to animate the hand and fingers in every single main key pose. You don't want to have a straight arm. You want to have a nice silhouette throughout, and you don't want to have this paddle hand. As you go from keyframe to keyframe and back into spline, it'll give a little bit of movement that you don't even have to animate once you have those main key poses in place. You might have to do a little tweaking, but it's just easier to tweak rather than animate this hand in every single frame that you're going to be doing or in between. So you do have to grab all three of these knuckles in order to animate that finger. And if you want to make life easier, hit clear here. Now I'm going to go and make a new shelf real quick. I'll name this the Mary shelf. I'm going to select this one, this knuckle here on the pinky, this knuckle, and this knuckle. I'm going to select all of this information here. We can see that we have all three pinky controls, and then I'm going to middle mouse button drag it up to the shelf here and click melt. It created a meld button for me. I'm going to edit it, go to shelves. On the icon label, go to, or say, LF pinky, so that we know it's the left pinky. Save all shelves. Alright, so this is our button. If I click off of this finger, you'll notice in the script editor, it selected our full pinky. So that makes life a little bit easier if you don't want to continuously go through and grab each of these fingers. I'll go ahead and choose these three for the ring finger, these three for the index. So I'll go through and make those buttons real quick, and then I have another thing to tell you about where to save your shelf. All right, for the thumb, just grab these two. So I have thumb 2, thumb 3. Create a meld button. All right. Now I don't have the right hand done yet, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to save your shelf. I'll go ahead and delete the one that I already had because I started building one earlier. All right, so this is our AV260 OneTaught folder, and I created a folder named Shelves. Now I'm going to open Okay, I'll just open Documents in new window and hopefully, yeah, okay. So if you go to this PC Documents, Maya 2019, because that's what I'm working in, Prefs, Shelves, I have a Mary shelf right here. It'll say Mel, because these are our Mel buttons. I'm going to drag it over. So now our Mary shelf is in our main folder, and we're able to load it from here. You want to drag that Mary shelf out of the preferences, because sometimes Maya will delete your shelf, delete your preferences even, or if you need to reset your preferences to make Maya not as glitchy and not crash as much, it'll also delete your shelf. So if you put it in here and you load from there, it'll just make life easier and you won't have to keep rebuilding your shelf and your button. So now I can go through at any point and click each of these fingers instead of having to try to select all of these controllers. This is the elbow control. I'm going to move this in a little bit. Don't use this control because that just, if you're doing a very stretchy character or stretchy animation, this just helps clean it up a little bit. You don't want that to happen within this animation. We're trying to stay close to our reference. We'll push it a little bit, but for the most part, we want it to look realistic. As realistic as you can with a cartoon character. All right, I almost selected that. Let's go ahead and select our pinky. I'm only going down the rotate Z. No other animation is occurring because it can start to turn into itself. So if I do this one, I don't usually use Mel buttons. I'm trying to remember to do that. So if I go just in this middle and try to rotate, notice how it'll be really weird. So I'm just going to Z. So if you're ever curious what I'm doing over here, you can always look at the title of the control and you can see the rotations that I just created. It's better to just kind of organically do those than follow my numbers exactly, because you won't really learn anything if you plug in exactly. But if there's something that's not quite working within your arm, something just seems off, you can always get past that by just plugging in those numbers exactly. So that looks pretty close. We have a little bit of that bend within the fingers, a loose kind of elbow, but a nicer silhouette here. I think I might push this body down just a little bit. And then pull this arm out just a little more. Don't pull the arm out too far because it'll get really stretchy. If you leave a little bit of bend, you know that you haven't gone too far with the stretch there. I'm obviously just going through and making the buttons for this hand so then it's easier to animate and select. Oops, here we go. Save all shelves real quick. I know that I did it earlier, but I just want to make sure. And I might have to, because I added new buttons, I might have to go in and move this from 2019 prefs. Nope, maybe not. It looks like it's taking it from the one that I moved to my desktop, which is great. If you want to get these fingers closer together, instead of doing what I just tried to do, you can come up here and move it on the Y, and it'll move that closer together. That's why I left those separate, so then I can just move them closer together separately. Okay, I think that's a pretty good positioning. She seems a little stiff, but since this is the neutral pose, we can always go from here and then alter later. Kind of getting those key poses in as quickly as possible. You want to not make them look awful, but you want to try to get through those quickly so then you can move on to the in-betweens. It's good to spend some time within this section just because this is the main storytelling poses and they're the most important. I'm going to use this one for my next pose for the squash. Selecting more than I want it to, because it feels like this is the pose before it starts moving a different direction. So it feels like this one's the next pose. Obviously there's going to be some in-betweens in here because that's a lot of time to not have any information. And we're also going to be changing our timing later. So now our spine is curved. I'm going to go ahead and just zero out all my rotations here to have a clean start with this portion of the animation, because sometimes it's hard to add on top of rotations that you already have. If you notice, my knees don't go beyond my feet. There's a bend. If we look straight up, this butt goes a little bit further back. That might add a little bit more bend as well. If this is curved this direction, then the hip and cog will go the other direction and counter animate. So it's going to go back. I'm going to start there, but I might have to rotate it forward at some point. So now that I have this spine bent, it looks nice and round. I'm going to move this cog forward. And now I'm going to help make this so the geometry is not kind of crushing into her shirt by moving this back or up this direction. So now the shirt doesn't feel so like it's so collapsed there. I'm pushing the pose a little bit more. I still don't want the knees to kind of go in front of the feet. They can a little bit, it's not that big of a deal, but I don't want them to be all the way out here. I want to have that balance of weight. But this is going to be a higher jump than what I had was here. So if we can kind of push this a little bit more, bring it down a little bit more, it'll give the momentum it needs to the character. Okay, I'm going to translate this back, and I'll have to rotate that hand. It's good to break the silhouette up so that everything's not twinning, and you can clearly see what's happening throughout the body. When you go into work cam, notice that if this was down lower, it would kind of intersect with this hand in the silhouette, and it's not as clear. But where I had it, it breaks it up more, and you can really see what's happening. It's always good to look at your pose after you've set it. in the camera that you're using so you can make sure that the action is very clear for the audience. Otherwise, things will be lost and a little confusing for them to see within that animation. I am also going to, I'm going to zero out this neck because I feel like that's a little strong. And I'm going to put that head rotated down. I'm going to rotate that neck up again. And now I'm going to rotate that spine up just a little bit so then the head's not looking below where it's planning to jump. That looks a little better. That makes more sense. Then I can tilt the head a little bit more. The light helps you as well. She has a light on her helmet, so if you're trying to figure out where the eyes are kind of pointing, the light is directing that information. I have this on at 6, I think, right now. No. I have it on at 7. That's all lights. So if you go to lighting, use all lights. So that's why I can see the light on the helmet. I'm bending the cog back, and I'm going to bend that spine again just to get that squash that I'm looking for, but also have her eyes directed to the pillar. I don't like what's going on here because it feels like the shirt is really indenting into the body, so I think I have the spine maybe down too far. So I'm looking at all aspects. I might try something and then realize this isn't really working now. I'm going to zero out this hip for a sec and then there we go. So I rotated that cog back again. It wasn't working how I had it. I'm going to bring this spine back down. All right. So since I translated that cog up a little bit, that helped it. Kind of want those fingers to be a little bit looser, like they're pointing back. So on the left pinky, I'm going to set a key for what I have right now. I'm going to select everything and then unselect that move all, key it, and I'm going to go ahead and save real quick so it doesn't crash on me. All right, well, my Maya crashed and I had to go through some processes to uninstall some things, and now we're back to square one. So let me hurry up and get back to where we're at. I think it's good to show you that yes, Maya crashes and sometimes it's a pain. And now I have to go through the process of redoing everything. All right, now we're ready for that stretch up pose. Let's see if I can find it in here. There we go. Save my scene real quick. Zero out the spine again. I don't know if sometimes that clone comes on and I don't know why, so just undo that if you see double controllers happen. All right. We know that there's that arc in the back, and we want the hands to kind of go up. I'm going to push the ball of the foot here. Notice that the arms are stretching. That's fine for now. It's just because we're using IK and we need to translate those arms in place. Take these shoulder controls off for now. Okay, I'm going to zero out the rotations on this hand, all of them, because we're going to move them to the front anyway. Again, that's why I kind of like IK a little better, because I don't have to do zero out all of the rotations, just those hands, and then I can kind of place them a lot faster. Anything that cuts down on time is nice in animation, just because everything's kind of a tedious process. If you can kind of get into a rhythm with it, it's relaxing, but if you can't get that rhythm, you can't find these kind of shortcuts, it can feel like a lot of work. The satisfaction in animation is when you can start to see the character come to life and all of the pieces start to fit together like a puzzle, and they work as one cohesive animation. So that's not how this arm is right now on this in the reference, but I'm pushing it a little bit further. I'm kind of relying on our knowledge from what we learned about the jump and the reference in images that we had. So I know that this is a potential, I can do this, and it's not completely out of the ordinary. Need to bring the elbow to the front and kind of out a little bit so we can get that bend that we want. Make sure you're not covering the face. And remember that we don't want twinning, we want a nice silhouette. So try to create a nice silhouette with those hands so they're not completely overlapping. And if one's higher than the other, or one's out in front further, it'll give some nice overlapping action as well, because one of them is going to animate a little quicker than the other to the next location. I'm going to create a fist for the hand, but I just want to see how this looks real quick, and I'm going to look at the work cam. I don't like how it covers the face, but I can always lift this. That kind of looks a little better. Alright. I feel like she's leaning a little too far forward because the next pose is probably going to be right here. So I'm going to pull her back a little bit. Whoops. Don't animate that hip with a translate. That can get you into some trouble. Make sure you're using the cog. The arms look a little funny here, so I could lift this up even more on the shoulders to kind of give a nicer look to that geometry and pose. And then I'll probably want to stretch the arms out just a little bit more, not too much, just to get some of that bend out. Alright, so I'm going to key that so we don't lose it. Notice that I haven't really moved the feet at all. They've stayed in place and they are only lifting up in that position. So if we go from here to here to here, they're all stuck on the ground because they're not lifting up in the air at all from these poses. Now that they're up in the air here, they'll start to move forward. So let's go ahead and look at this pose in our work cam. I could probably move that hand out of the way just a little bit so then we can actually see the face. Now I have to kind of come in here and just make sure, oh, I need the perspective view. I'm going to turn this one to my perspective view because we don't really look at the front. All right, now I have to, so when we're looking at it on the side, it is covering her face, but when we were looking at it from the work cam, she's fine. So I can push this a little bit more. And I think I'm going to bring this down just a little bit. So just from these poses, you can start to feel that pendulum motion with the arms and how the body is squashing down. It feels like some nice arcs going through. You can feel that movement already. All right, so the next pose, oh, let me get these hands finished. I forgot to do those. I always forget to get back to my original key and start to move the hands and try to key something when it needs to be on that full key. So make sure you're back on that full key. I'm going to select my controls that I just messed with and middle mouse button drag back to that key and hit S. Sometimes it's helpful to have little images so then you know what part of the hand this is quickly instead of trying to read the labels, but I don't want to spend too much time going through everything because this is already going to be a lot to watch. But I think going through the entire process of an animation will be really helpful. And a nice refresher from Character Animation 1. So if you have reference on your hands, this can be a lot easier because I'm just kind of making something up right now. When I'm sitting at my desk, sometimes I'll just lift my hand up in the air, look at my hand, and see how it looks. I feel like this part doesn't make sense. It's too out there, but I don't know. That seems weirder or stranger. Maybe because it's not a tight fist, that's why it looks like that. Let me zero this out. Start from scratch on that thumb. We'll go with that. Alright, so now we need to do the other hand. And we don't have any reference for that, but I'm just going to kind of guess here as well. Sometimes it's good to have multiple angles. If you want more reference, it makes animating a little bit faster. Oh man. I just lost everything because I scrubbed through my animation. Once you rotate that hand, you might have to put a little bit more bend into the arms. All right, I think that's good. All right, now we need the next pose, which is the air, the free fall in the air. I'm gonna use this one as my pose, I think. I might take a couple different ones to make that. I don't want the feet to go together, so I might take a little bit, maybe one back here for the leg and then one right here for the leg potentially, but squashed up a little bit more, really squashing the character to make it feel like they're trying to use that momentum to get through the air. All right, so I'm going to zero out my rotations again on the spine. Move them into the middle. Whoops. Since we want to clear that platform, I'm going to get a little bit higher so then I can have a nicer arc from that position. So don't mind the knees and everything yet. I'm just trying to find that translate that I want. You can move things together too, like the cog, the hands when they're in IK, and the knees and the feet. These are the elbows. Those also can be translated. So for this one, I'm going to have the foot on the heel. Remember, we're never using rotate X, Y, and Z when we want to rotate the foot back. We have to use the heel lift. I think I'm going to do 75 here. Now I can't figure. Okay, if you left click and drag, that's how I'm doing that number scrolling or scrubbing. And sometimes it can make Maya crash a little bit if it's going to be a really big number and you're doing that for a little bit. So if you can just plug in a good number and then alter it a little bit, it might be a little better. This might be too high, but I'm going to see what it gives us. Since I'm using a couple of different keys to get this for the feet, I want to make sure that I key this or I'm going to lose all that information. Now I can scrub back and I can see I'm going to have this foot come up a little bit on the heel like this and then push it out a little bit more. So what that means is if I'm going to separate these feet like this, oh, gotta save. If I'm going to separate these feet like this, the one that's in front will land first. So I'll need to have that land on the heel when it hits the platform first. I'm trying to point this foot back from where it came from so then it has a nice arc. We know that it's bending forward. Actually, oh look, I'm on the incorrect key again. We need to use the key that we have. I just selected everything and middle mouse button dragged back to get to this position. So the actual back is bent up, but a little bit more than it was prior in the last position. If this foot's forward like that, then this is kind of the one that's holding most of that weight because she's flinging this leg forward now. So if we think about it as kind of what happens in a walk, if this one's being flung forward like a high pose, then we have to do some of those changes within the cog and the spine to help her get that foot up in there. So I'm leaning it toward this foot. There we go. See, the hip will help push that animation a little bit more. I'll probably still have to alter it, but now I need to counter more in the spine. I don't want this to happen where the shirt goes through the jeans, so I need to figure out what I need to do here to fix that. It helps if you can have good reference when it comes to this portion if they're going to have the feet separated. Wondering if it would be better to do this. All right, I'm going to save that. I'm trying to figure out this pose, but since I'm using a couple different things, I don't really like what's happening. Hold on a sec. All right, so for this portion of the animation, I'm going to kind of use more of the knowledge that we gained from looking at this animation. And that's kind of what's happening within my reference too, is the back is bent like this. So this is kind of the pose that I'm going to go for here. I'm going to zero everything out on the body or the spine. for the rotates, not the translates. All right. Now I am going to translate the feet, the IK hands, the cog, the knees, and the elbows up, because this has to be the highest point. I'm really looking at the cog on this and whether that'll be a good arc. Be careful when you're selecting, because you can select teeth and things within that mouth. So make sure you're getting the right controller here. Obviously, this isn't exactly how it looks on my animation, but I'm pushing it a little bit further, and I'm thinking about the arcs. I'm thinking about how the character would be able to do this pose. I'm thinking about weight shifts. If this foot's flinging out in front, then this hip probably has to go back and down a little bit. And then the, well, hip and cog. And then the spine has to counter animate to whatever I just did. I think it looks weird because I still have some animation on these shoulders. The head kind of does whatever the hip does. Hip cog. Hip and cog. I think if this leg is up that high and in front that far, then this arm can go back a little bit. If you think about the walk cycle or walks and how the arm is opposite to the leg on the same side. Something like that. And then this one can come out more to counter animate what's happening in the leg since it's back more. Are we still on our same trajectory from the original position? Let's check. It kind of feels like she's going off to the side a bit, so let's move her to the right to kind of line up with that last position. So I'll take the feet, the cog, the knees, the elbows, and the wrists, and I'll just translate it to my right. Okay, now if we look up, oh, look, I did it again. Middle mouse button, drag back, and then I'm going to delete that key because we just want that full key. We don't want these extra keys. That looks a little better. We might have to clean it up a little bit once we get this into spline, but I feel like they're all going in the same direction now. Alright, so we can turn off the NURBS curves so it's a little easier to see. You can kind of feel that jump now, that snap up. So I like what's happening. We can move on to our next pose now. So what's our next pose? It's a contact. All right, so our next pose is that fall contact where the heels hit first. Let me go ahead and save. I don't know. And we know that we want that foot to contact first. I might need to lift her up in the air on this pose a little bit more if I'm going to have her stretch out. So let's go ahead and do that. So now the next one on my hop, I land with my toes because it's not very far that I'm jumping, but she needs to land with her heel contact. We can still use some of that information though. So this back is a little bit more rounded, but in order to make this arc nicer, I'm going to bend it and stretch it backward a little bit more. I'm making sure that the foot doesn't go through the geometry, but it's touching the geometry. Sometimes when the textures are on, it's a little bit easier to see. It's easier to see when the default lighting is on as well. I'm going to zero out some of this information on the spine again. The leg is looking weird because of the knee placement. If you can't see our controllers, if you hit 4, sometimes that'll help and you can find it. Not quite seeing the knee controller. Maybe it'll appear once I have some stuff in place. I can always go back to a previous frame and... Oh, there it is. Okay. It's just really high up in the air. I just hit 6 to get back to the shaded version instead of the wireframe. I'm going to go look at our previous images just to see what we are working with here. So it's stretching back to the previous location on that one. This one's kind of got that stretch back as well, but it's already landed. There we go. So more of a bend there, but it is stretched back when it comes to the leg is stretched out further, and then the body is kind of stretched back here. So I like what's going on there. Maybe we'll bring her back a little bit more to stretch that leg out. Kind of create like a passing pose almost. It's just a little bit higher in the air for the foot. So if we're doing that, then we'll need to tilt the body a bit toward the leg that's going to be holding the weight. Maybe not that much, just because she's in the air. I'm going to zero out the hands. I like how those hands are, so maybe I'll do something more like that. And then my hands are like that as well, so. Again, thinking about if that leg's in front, maybe this arm can trail a little bit to kind of counter animate to that and try to balance itself. And I'm going to save my original as well. You can start to feel in this pose that the character is landing. I am going to zero those out and then just kind of rotate them down again. her finger looked bent there, so just fix that a little bit. And that could work. Gotta find that elbow. Oh, there it is. It's in her head. I'm kind of liking this pose. There's all kinds of different ways that you can do a certain animation, so just as long as the weight feels nice, then you're okay. Oops, I labeled that one wrong. Oh well. That's why I wanted to put them in order, so then I could have them the exact same as the other side, and I'll just click on the button that is correct. Maybe something like that. Like that. Okay, keyed. I'm gonna save because we have a nice pose there. I'm gonna turn off the NURBS curve so you can see this a little better. Now from the side view. Makes sense. And it's nice, it's not twinning there because the one arm is higher than the other. Let's go and look at the work cam. And that looks like a nice silhouette. I could probably move that knee out to break up that pose a little bit. Let me go to perspective view and show NURBS curves. Yep, and I have to make sure to be on the key that I'm working on. I kind of like where that knee was, so maybe I'll move the character forward a little bit more. And see what that looks like. Yeah, it kind of feels like there's a little bit more dimension here now. I can probably move this leg forward because it felt like it didn't have a nice arc there. Get out my key that I was working on. Looking at the arcs. Yeah, that felt a little better. All right, so let's go ahead and go to our next pose. We need our kind of the squash or the recoil. What do they call it? The recovery. It's not typically good to use other people's animations for your reference, but I think it's helpful in the case of just trying to teach you what this is, what's happening here. All right, so let's get this squash in. For the squash, I'm going to do the 2 feet on the ground, but we would need another pose in there to have this foot contact first and then this foot contacts with the heel. But I'm just going to do both feet on the ground for this squash, and then we'll build in that pose or in between when we go back through after we go through spline. I'm going to look at our reference over here as well. Okay, so I'm going to push those arms forward, I think. Oh, I got to get my perspective view up. All right, I'm going to zero out everything happening through the spine with the rotates here. Now we know this foot's not going to move when it comes to translates. It's going to stick flat on the ground. It's going to plant So I'm going to slam this heel down. And I can also key all of these translates. Now we have to figure out where we want this foot. I'm going to put this one flat on the ground first as well, just so then we get our main pose in here for the squash. Let's look at the feet here. Yeah, we can spread those feet out just a little bit. I'm going to do a heel spin. I'm going to take the cog, the hands, and the elbows, translate those in place, and translate them down. I have to fix the knees because of the location. All right, so let's look at, there's a curve to that spine and as well with that one. So we know that the hip and cog will be the opposite direction. So this needs to rotate backwards because we're counter animating there. Now we have to think about the positioning here. I'm gonna rotate it. I'm rotating it toward that leg in the front, the hip and cog. I'm also trying to see if I can fix some of this shirt, and I might not be able to, so that's fine. All right, so since this foot's planted first, I'm going to lean toward that foot because it has most of the weight on it. Now we have to counter animate some of those rotations that we did. This leg kind of feels like it's more in the back, so I'm going to push this one forward, this arm, to counter animate that. Since this one's more in the front, I'll put this one more in the back. Move that elbow forward so I have a little more control. I think I like this one out to the side more instead of back. Let's see if that makes sense. We'll key that. Oh, I have to have my selections correct. Let's look at this again. There's like that pendulum happening. Okay, so let's see if we're getting that same pendulum happening from the first pose to this pose, or from that last pose to this pose. I feel like the arm should go back more, just because of how we animated this one. I'm gonna kind of take this cue since I'm just trying to figure out what's gonna look better here. I'm kind of guessing at this point because we kind of changed up our pose. That kind of feels better. Feels a little more balanced. Remember that the head does whatever the hip and cog do, so if it's tilted this way, it's also kind of leaning that way, and it's back. All right, I'm gonna go with that for my pose. The arcs seem to make sense throughout the body. I'm looking at everything from the elbows to the hands to the hip and cog. All right, so we have that pose. And if we go to the work cam, let's check that silhouette. It's broken up a little bit more. I think it can work. Okay, so our next pose is going to be that neutral pose. So let's look at the screen and see what that neutral pose is. In this reference, there's more of a bend, but I think it'll look nicer if there's a straight kind of neutral pose. A straighter. I guess that's kind of what it looks like as well. Still bending. I would say this like pose where it's bent. This is kind of what that pose looks like in the reference, but I want to do the one after it where it's completely straight up. A little more straight. Because it'll just help balance out that squash, and it'll, sometimes when you do more of an extreme position right after that, there we go, that's what I'm looking for. When you do an extreme position after that squash, it really helps sell the fact that something new occurred instead of it kind of dragging into from that position and feeling floaty. I'm looking for that straight up and down kind of positioning. So the feet won't move at all yet. We'll have to just get into our straight. It'll have some bends and stuff. For the most part, this would be our straight neutral pose. I'm going to zero these hands out real quick. Alright, so now that she's standing, and there's going to be balance between the two legs, I'm going to rotate the cog to kind of feel like they're centered, or the center of gravity is centered between those two legs. That's what cog stands for, is center of gravity. I want this to be in the position in the front of that leg. Okay. I'm going to move these arms up just so that we don't have to see how stretchy they are. There we go. Alright, so I'm going to rotate this to kind of balance it between those two legs. Centering that weight over the two legs. Now, if this is rotated kind of forward, so then the hip and cog are facing or rotating toward the front leg, then I need to kind of alter the spine here to the opposite direction in rotation. I am going to bend this forward just a bit and bend that spine back just a bit, like it's trying to gain that balance after coming in or bouncing up from that squash. Since the leg in front's a little bit further in front, I'm going to put this arm in back just a little bit. I think I'm going to, when we look from this pose to this pose and then back up, it feels like there's going to be more weight on this leg in front just to help balance the character. So I'm going to just push it a little bit more. Like it's kind of leaning off of this leg to get into that up position, like it helps shoot him up from that leg. Alright, keying. I feel like that makes more sense. Yeah. So if that's the case, then I am going to lean this body to this leg. That feels like a more balanced body there. Keying that pose, that's our neutral pose. And we'll move on from there. I might alter the hands later, but right now we'll keep those how they are. I think I'm going to bend these fingers just a little bit more. Not quite a fist. All right. Now the next thing we have to do is start to turn the character and shift the weight so then it can go to this next positioning.